On June 6, 1944, the fate of World War II hung in the balance as Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. Known as D-Day, this operation was meant to break through Nazi defenses in Western Europe and begin the liberation of France. Years of planning, deception, and preparation had led to this moment. But despite the scale and coordination, the entire operation came dangerously close to failure. In the early hours of the morning, before the main landings began, thousands of paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission was critical. They needed to secure key roads, bridges, and defensive positions to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. However, things immediately began to go wrong. Strong winds, heavy clouds, and poor visibility scattered the airborne troops far from their intended drop zones. Units that were supposed to land together found themselves isolated and disorganized. Some soldiers landed miles away from their objectives, while others were dropped directly into flooded fields, drowning under the weight of their equipment. Confusion spread quickly. Officers struggled to regroup their men in the darkness. Radio communication was limited, and many soldiers had no idea where they were or how to reach their targets. Yet despite the chaos, small groups of paratroopers began to form and move toward their objectives, relying on instinct and determination rather than clear orders. While this was happening behind enemy lines, the main invasion force was approaching the coast of Normandy. Hundreds of ships filled the English Channel, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers toward 5 designated landing zones: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches. The scale of the operation was enormous, unlike anything the world had ever seen. But even before reaching the shore, problems began to emerge. Rough seas caused many soldiers to become seasick, weakening them before they even reached the battlefield. Landing craft were tossed by waves, making coordination difficult. Some units were delayed, while others were dropped off at incorrect locations. As dawn broke, the German defenses came into view. The coastline was heavily fortified. Machine gun nests, artillery positions, and obstacles lined the beaches. The Germans had spent years preparing for an invasion, and although they had been misled about where it would occur, their defenses were still deadly. Then the bombardment began. Allied naval guns opened fire, attempting to destroy German positions before the troops landed. Bombers flew overhead, dropping explosives in an effort to weaken the defenses. However, many of these strikes missed their targets due to poor visibility and timing issues. This meant that when the first wave of soldiers reached the beaches, many German defenses were still intact. Nowhere was this more evident than at Omaha Beach. As landing craft approached the shore, German machine guns opened fire. Bullets tore through the front ranks of soldiers before they could even exit their boats. Some landing craft were hit directly, causing heavy casualties before the ramps even dropped. When the ramps finally opened, chaos erupted. Soldiers poured into the water under intense fire. Many were cut down instantly. Others struggled through deep water, weighed down by equipment, trying to reach the shore. Explosions filled the air as artillery shells landed among them. Within minutes, entire units were wiped out. Those who managed to reach the beach found themselves pinned down behind small obstacles or craters, unable to move forward. The open sand offered little protection, and any attempt to advance was met with deadly fire from above. Officers were killed. Communication broke down. Units became disorganized. For a moment, it seemed like the invasion might fail. Some commanders began to consider the possibility of retreat. The losses were mounting rapidly, and there appeared to be no way to break through the German defenses. If Omaha Beach failed, the entire operation could collapse. But amidst the chaos, something began to change. Small groups of soldiers started taking initiative. Without waiting for orders, they began to move along the beach, finding gaps in the defenses. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire. Others used grenades and explosives to destroy machine gun nests one by one. These actions were not part of a coordinated plan. They were acts of survival, and they would determine the outcome of the day. Meanwhile, at Utah Beach, the situation unfolded differently. Due to navigation errors, American forces landed slightly off course. Ironically, this mistake worked in their favor. They encountered lighter resistance than expected and were able to move inland more quickly. The commander on the ground reportedly made a simple decision. Instead of correcting the landing location, he ordered his troops to continue forward from where they were. This decision helped secure the beach more rapidly. Across the other landing zones, British and Canadian forces faced their own challenges but managed to make steady progress. However, the situation at Omaha remained critical. Back on the beach, the tide began to rise. Wounded soldiers were left exposed as the water crept closer. Equipment was lost. Landing zones became even more chaotic. Yet despite everything, more troops continued to arrive. Wave after wave of soldiers landed under fire. And slowly, inch by inch, they began to push forward. As the battle on Omaha Beach continued, the situation remained desperate. The initial waves had suffered devastating losses, and the beach was filled with wounded soldiers, destroyed equipment, and chaos. The carefully planned assault had broken down under the intensity of German resistance, and for a time, it seemed that no organized advance was possible. German forces held the high ground above the beach, giving them a clear advantage. From bunkers and fortified positions, they fired down on the Allied troops below, cutting off movement and preventing any large-scale push inland. Machine guns swept across the sand, while artillery continued to strike incoming landing craft. For the soldiers pinned on the beach, survival depended on staying low and finding whatever cover they could. Some hid behind steel obstacles placed in the water to block landing craft. Others took shelter in shallow craters created by explosions. But these offered only limited protection. Any movement across open ground could be fatal. The situation was made worse by the loss of leadership. Many officers had been killed or wounded in the first moments of the landing. Without clear command, units were scattered and disorganized. Soldiers found themselves fighting alongside strangers, forming small groups based on proximity rather than structure. Communication was nearly impossible. Radio equipment had been damaged or lost, and the noise of battle made coordination difficult. Orders could not be passed effectively, and many soldiers had to make decisions on their own without knowing the broader situation. Yet it was in this chaos that the tide began to turn. Individual acts of courage started to change the course of the battle. Small groups of soldiers began to move toward the cliffs, using terrain features for cover. Instead of attempting a direct assault, they worked their way along the beach, searching for weak points in the German defenses. Engineers used explosives to destroy barbed wire and obstacles, creating narrow paths forward. Some soldiers climbed the cliffs under fire. Using ropes, craters, and natural cover, they slowly made their way upward toward the enemy positions. Once at the top, they attacked from angles the Germans did not expect, disrupting their defensive lines. These actions were not coordinated on a large scale. They were the result of individual decisions made under extreme pressure. But together, they began to weaken the German hold on the beach. At the same time, naval support played a critical role. Warships positioned offshore moved closer to the coast than planned, risking enemy fire to provide direct support. Their guns targeted German bunkers and strongpoints that had survived the initial bombardment. These precise strikes helped reduce some of the most dangerous positions, allowing troops on the ground to advance. Slowly, the balance began to shift. By mid-morning, small breakthroughs had been achieved. Soldiers who had reached the top of the cliffs began attacking German positions from behind, forcing them to retreat or reposition. This reduced the intensity of fire directed at the beach. Reinforcements continued to arrive. Despite the heavy losses, new waves of troops kept landing. Each wave added more strength to the Allied presence, making it harder for German forces to maintain control. What had once been a desperate situation started to evolve into a gradual push forward. Still, the cost was enormous. The beach remained littered with the fallen, and the wounded continued to suffer as medics worked under fire to provide aid. The conditions were brutal, and the outcome was still uncertain. Meanwhile, German command faced its own problems. Confusion and delays affected their response. The Allied deception campaign had convinced many German leaders that the main invasion would occur elsewhere, particularly at Pas-de-Calais. As a result, some units were held back, waiting for a second attack that never came. This hesitation proved critical. Reinforcements that could have strengthened the defenses at Normandy were delayed or not deployed in time. Additionally, communication within the German command structure was slow, and decisions required approval from higher authorities, further reducing their ability to react quickly. Weather conditions also played a role. The same rough seas that caused difficulties for the Allies had led the Germans to believe that an invasion was unlikely on that day. This contributed to a reduced state of readiness among some units. All of these factors combined to give the Allies a narrow window of opportunity. By early afternoon, the situation at Omaha Beach had changed significantly. What had once been a near disaster was now a fragile foothold. Allied troops had managed to secure parts of the coastline and establish initial positions inland. While the fighting was far from over, the immediate danger of total failure had been avoided. Elsewhere along the Normandy coast, progress continued. British and Canadian forces advanced from their landing zones, securing key objectives and pushing further inland. Paratroopers behind enemy lines, despite their scattered landings, had succeeded in disrupting German movements and securing important positions. These successes helped stabilize the overall operation. The invasion, though nearly derailed at multiple points, was beginning to take hold. But the question remained, how had such a massive operation come so close to failure, and what ultimately allowed it to succeed? As the day continued, the outcome of the invasion began to depend not just on bravery on the beaches, but on a combination of strategy, deception, and timing that had been set in motion long before June 6, 1944. While the soldiers on the ground fought for every meter of sand and cliff, larger forces were shaping the direction of the battle behind the scenes. One of the most important factors was the Allied deception campaign. For months leading up to D-Day, the Allies had carried out an elaborate operation designed to mislead German intelligence. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio signals, and controlled leaks of information created the illusion that the main invasion would take place at Pas de Calais, the closest point between Britain and France. This deception worked. Even as the landings at Normandy were underway, many German commanders believed that it was only a diversion. They expected a much larger invasion to follow somewhere else. As a result, critical reinforcements were held back, waiting for an attack that never came. This hesitation gave the Allies valuable time. Instead of facing the full strength of German defenses immediately, they were able to establish their positions gradually. Every hour that passed without a decisive German counterattack increased the chances of success. Another key factor was air superiority. Allied aircraft dominated the skies over Normandy, making it extremely difficult for German forces to move reinforcements or supplies during the day. Roads, bridges, and rail lines had been heavily bombed in the weeks before the invasion, disrupting transportation networks. German units attempting to reach the front faced constant threats from air attacks. This slowed their response and prevented them from organizing a coordinated counterattack. Meanwhile, Allied forces were able to continue landing troops and equipment with relatively less interference. Naval power also played a crucial role. The massive fleet supporting the invasion provided continuous fire support, targeting German positions and helping to protect the landing forces. The presence of so many ships ensured that supplies, reinforcements, and heavy equipment could be delivered to the beaches throughout the day. This steady flow of resources made a significant difference. While the first waves had struggled, later waves arrived with more support and better coordination. Tanks, artillery, and additional troops helped strengthen the Allied position and allowed them to push further inland. Leadership decisions also influenced the outcome. On the Allied side, commanders allowed flexibility on the ground. When units landed off course or encountered unexpected resistance, they adapted rather than strictly following the original plan. This ability to adjust in real time helped overcome many of the challenges faced during the invasion. In contrast, German command was more rigid. Decisions often required approval from higher authorities, including Adolf Hitler himself. This slowed the response to the invasion and prevented rapid deployment of armored divisions that could have posed a serious threat to the beachheads. Timing was another critical element. The invasion was launched during a narrow window of favorable conditions, balancing tides, moonlight, and weather. Although the weather was far from ideal, it contributed to the element of surprise. German forces did not expect an attack under such conditions, which reduced their readiness. By the afternoon of D-Day, the situation had stabilized enough for the Allies to begin consolidating their gains. The beaches were no longer isolated points of conflict but parts of a growing front line. Units that had landed earlier started linking up with each other, creating a more unified force. Supply lines were established, and defensive positions were secured against potential counterattacks. The cost, however, remained high. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded. Entire units had been decimated in the initial hours of the invasion. The success of the operation came at a significant human cost, one that would be remembered long after the war. Yet despite these losses, the invasion had achieved its primary objective. A foothold in Nazi-occupied France had been established. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. From this point forward, Allied forces would push deeper into Europe, eventually leading to the liberation of Paris and the defeat of Nazi Germany. The success of D-Day created the conditions necessary for this advance, even though it had nearly failed in its earliest moments. Looking back, it becomes clear that D-Day was not a single moment of victory. It was a series of fragile successes, each one dependent on the previous. If the airborne troops had failed completely, if the beaches had not been secured, if German reinforcements had arrived sooner, the outcome could have been very different. The margin between success and failure was incredibly small, and for several critical hours on June 6, 1944, the entire operation stood on the edge of collapse. Yet it did not fall. Because of a combination of courage, adaptation, and circumstance, the Allies managed to turn a near disaster into one of the most significant victories of the war. The day D-Day almost failed became the day it succeeded. As the war ended and the world began to process what had just occurred, the use of atomic weapons marked the beginning of a completely new era in human history, often referred to as the Atomic Age. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated that a single bomb could devastate an entire city in a matter of seconds, changing the scale and nature of warfare forever. Nations around the world quickly realized that this new technology had the potential to redefine global power and security. In the years that followed, the United States and the Soviet Union would enter a period of intense rivalry known as the Cold War, during which nuclear weapons became central to military strategy and international politics. The concept of deterrence emerged as countries developed larger and more powerful arsenals in an effort to prevent conflict through the threat of mutual destruction. The events of August 1945 were therefore not only the conclusion of the Second World War but also the starting point of a new kind of geopolitical tension that would last for decades. The aircraft that carried out the first atomic bombing mission, the Enola Gay, became a symbol of this transformation. It represented both the technological achievement of the era and the profound moral and ethical questions raised by the use of such a weapon. For the crew who had participated in the mission, life after the war was shaped by the knowledge of what they had been part of. Some viewed their actions as a necessary step to end the war and save lives by avoiding a prolonged invasion, while others reflected on the immense destruction caused by the bomb. Public opinion on the use of atomic weapons has varied over time, with ongoing debates about whether their use was justified or whether alternative paths could have been taken. Historians continue to examine the decisions made during those final days of the war, analyzing the political, military, and humanitarian factors involved. Regardless of these debates, the impact of the atomic bombings cannot be denied. They brought about the rapid end of the war in the Pacific and set the stage for a new global order shaped by nuclear capability. The legacy of these events extends far beyond the immediate aftermath, as they influenced international agreements, efforts at arms control, and the development of policies aimed at preventing the use of nuclear weapons in future conflicts. The story of the Enola Gay remains a powerful reminder of how technological advancement can have far-reaching consequences and how decisions made during times of war can shape the course of history for generations to come. Today, the aircraft itself is preserved as a historical artifact, allowing people to reflect on the events of 1945 and the lessons that can be learned from them. It stands as a symbol of a moment when the world changed forever, when the boundaries of warfare were expanded beyond anything previously imagined, and when humanity entered an age defined by both incredible scientific progress and the constant awareness of its potential for destruction. The mission of the Enola Gay was not just a military operation but a turning point that continues to influence how nations think about power, responsibility, and the future of global conflict.